talk about Ecosystem Notes Part 1, and it's continuing on our path of looking at all the interactions at the different levels that we could study them in ecology. So first we started at the organism level, and we moved on to studying the interactions that happen in a group of species or a group of individuals of the same species that make up a population. Most recently, we talked about interactions that were specific to communities. So interactions that can take place between organisms of the same species and of different species. And now we're going to move on to ecosystems, which now includes interactions between both biotic and abiotic components of the environment. So now we are going to bring in abiotic components and kind of talk about how those interactions with the living sphere, the biotic ecosystem, are going to be really important. So some essential questions that through today's lesson and next time's lesson will be really important. What limits the production in an ecosystem? So what puts a kind of a cap on how much biomass can be produced in an ecosystem? How do these abiotic nutrients that are essential for all life move in and through the ecosystem? And how does energy itself move from the very foundation, the producers of the ecosystem, all the way through to the top of the food chain? So this is kind of what this two-part section of notes is going to be about. So firstly, let's just talk a little bit about ecosystems. Ecosystems are all the organisms that were present in a community, so the different populations, plus any abiotic factors. So things like the soil and the pH and the rainfall and sunlight, now all of those things are included too, so we get some new interactions that can take place. Ecosystems are transformers of energy and processors of matter. So the energy that we'll talk about next time, that is available to that ecosystem must pass through all of the different, we'll learn the term trophic levels of that ecosystem, and so too must all of the nutrients that are necessary for biotic life, and we'll talk about how those are processed today. Most important is ecosystems are self-sustaining. Self-sustaining. Through recycling of matter and of energy, they don't really need any net inputs from outside of the ecosystem. So they are masters at capturing energy, transferring it from one part or one level of the ecosystem to the next, and to cycling or recycling, reusing nutrients. And we will specifically look at that third part here, how the ecosystems cycle nutrients today. So if we look at this picture of the globe as, or the world as a kind of a model for an ecosystem, there are a few inputs that are necessary. So the sun is the ultimate source of energy, and it supplies a pretty much constant input of energy, right? The sun isn't really turned off at any time. I might say like, oh, nighttime, I mean, yeah, but pretty much it's a constant input of energy into our ecosystem, and then energy flows through our ecosystem from the organisms that are able to initially capture that all the way to all of the living things in our ecosystem. And two, nutrients must be put into our ecosystem. And instead of them being delivered by like the sun, they are constantly cycled. Constantly cycled. Since matter can't be created or destroyed, it can be used. Nutrients can only cycle through our ecosystem. So once they're used up, they're returned to what we'll call the abiotic reservoir, and then eventually come back into our ecosystem. So this is a picture of a generalized nutrient cycle. It's not specific to any of them that we're going to look at. It's just a general net for you to get the idea. So here at the base, at the bottom, is what we call the abiotic reservoir. Whether it's the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, an abiotic reservoir is basically where a large amount of that nutrient can be stored um, outside of any living organism. And when we start talking about the cycles, I'll be sure to explicitly mention the abiotic reservoirs for them, right? Usually, the abiotic reservoirs, like you can see here, also cycle through called geological processes. So here's an example. When we talk about the carbon cycle, one of the main abiotic reservoirs for carbon is in the atmosphere in carbon dioxide, or in the ocean in calcium carbonate in seashells. Okay, one geologic process that exists to help exchange those is lithification. So sometimes carbon dioxide, for example, in seashells, can be turned into rock, into coal, and stored that way through a geological process. And then through weathering and erosion, that carbon dioxide can be returned back to the abiotic reservoir. From the abiotic reservoirs, though, the nutrients enter the food chain or are made available to producers, to plants. That's what this producer part appears. These are the plants, the photosynthetic organisms. And then those producers are consumed by animals or fungi or consumers, things that can't make their own food, and the nutrients flow into the consumers. When the consumers and the producers die, they are decomposed by things like mushrooms and bacteria, which then return those nutrients stored in the tissues of the producers and the consumers back to the abiotic reservoir. So decomposers are really important because they really finalize, connect this whole cycle. They really connect the biotic and the abiotic reservoirs together so that we can have the cycling. If we didn't have them, all of the nutrients that were uh, stored in the abiotic reservoirs would just end up stuck in dead tissue in plants and animals and could never be recycled. So next we're going to kind of look at the main important cycles to know, and I'm going to kind of move in the direction to start with the ones that I think will be most important or slash you'll need to spend most time on, and then end with the ones that you should spend the least amount of time on. So the first is the carbon cycle. Carbon is really important because it's needed for uh, every single living thing. It's carbon-based life forms. It's in all of the biological macromolecules, so it is super important. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the main abiotic reservoir. That's where most carbon is stored in outside of living things. And that carbon moves into biotic organisms mainly through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes carbon and fixes it so that plants can use it as part of their carbohydrates. And then when animals eat those plants, it transfers to them, so it can be part of the animals' bodies. One way in which carbon returns to the abiotic reservoir is through cellular respiration. use breaking down carbon-containing compounds in plants and animals to make ATP, and one of the byproducts is CO2, which then goes back into the atmosphere. So even right here, even between plants and animals and the abiotic reservoir, we have a kind of a mini cycle right there. So CO2 in the atmosphere is the main abiotic reservoir. It enters through the food chain through photosynthesis, so carbon fixation in the Calvin cycle, and it returns to the abiotic reservoir through cellular respiration. That's kind of how we most classically think of the carbon cycle, but there's other parts or portions of the carbon cycle we need to be aware of. For example, and I'm going to go back, make sure you take time to, sorry, make sure you take time to look at this, but I'm going to go back so we can see more of the picture that it blocked up. Other parts of the carbon cycle that we should understand is, okay, over here in the aquatic ecosystem, carbon dioxide remains at equilibrium with dissolved CO2 in water. So it can directly dissolve in water and evaporate out of water. And that dissolved CO2 through photosynthesis can be stored in aquatic plants and algae, which then provide the carbon for animals. Dissolved CO2, though, can also be stored as bicarbonates, like in shells. And shells eventually can be turned into sediments, into rocks, and in conjunction with the dead material from these animals, be imparted into the soil, just how dead animals and plants in the terrestrial ecosystem can impart carbon to the soil through rotting and decomposition. When the carbon is in the soil, a few things can happen to it. One, bacteria can directly turn it back into carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere, or it can be uh, lithified over long periods of time and turn into oil or gas or coal, which then can be burned in combustion fuels, which turns it back into CO2 into the abiotic reservoir. So just a few more things about the carbon cycle. The next is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is really important because to make proteins and to make nucleic acids, the two main things that nitrogen are needed for. So being at a loss of nitrogen will not allow a community or an ecosystem to continue to exist. So let's take a look. In the environment, at the atmosphere, just like carbon dioxide, the atmosphere is the main source of or abiotic reservoir for nitrogen. So what you need to understand about nitrogen is a gas, it's N2. So two nitrogen atoms joined, so I make these a little bit bigger, with a triple bond. And that triple bond is really important because it makes atmospheric nitrogen N2 extremely stable, extremely hard to break down. And N2, like this, right here, can't be used in living organisms. Can't use N2 because it can't be broken down in their biological systems. It's too strong, so too stable. So to be able to enter the food chain, it has to be what's called fixed. Just like carbon dioxide is fixed in the Calvin cycle, turned into usable organic compounds, nitrogen N2 needs to be fixed to be enter into the food chain. And that's what these bacteria do. So main ways that N2 is fixed is through nitrogen fixing bacteria that are in a mutualistic relationship with plant roots, and free nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil. So they are the main fixers of nitrogen in the ecosystem. And then from there, they're able to be absorbed by plants through the roots and enter into the ecosystem's producers. And then plants, when they're eaten by consumers, then can enter into animals, right? These soil nitrates also can enter the aquatic ecosystems and the fish and the birds and things in the aquatic ecosystems. There are also plankton that have nitrogen fixing bacteria associated with them that can directly fix atmospheric nitrogen so it can enter aquatic ecosystems. Right? Then in both cases, terrestrial or aquatic, the death and decomposition or the excretion of animals in the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems can return nitrogen back to the soil, and decomposing uh, ammonifying and nitrifying bacteria can return that nitrogen to soil nitrates that could be used again in plants or could react with what's called denitrifying bacteria and be returned back to the abiotic reservoir atmospheric nitrogen. So these denitrifying bacteria, if you look at it, are extremely important because if you notice, they're the only part of this whole cycle that's returning nitrogen back to the atmosphere. That's why it's really important, like in the school forest, to burn the prairie. Because otherwise the nitrogen is locked up into the plants and the animals in the food chain. It can never be returned to the soil. And if it's not returned to the soil, that ecosystem, like the prairie, can't support new growth because it's at a nitrogen deficit. So nitrogen in the atmosphere is the main abiotic reservoir in the nitrogen cycle. It enters the food chain through nitrogen fixation by soil and aquatic bacteria. It's recycled by decomposing and nitrifying bacteria, and it's returned to the abiotic reservoir, the atmosphere, by denitrifying bacteria. So I'm going to say the nitrogen cycle is going to be pretty important. So you should spend some time kind of understanding this idea. You don't have to really understand the detailed differences between a decomposing bacteria, an ammonifying bacteria, and a nitrifying bacteria, but understand, for example, that bacteria return nitrogen to the soil by breaking it down from dead organic matter. The phosphorus cycle is not as important. I wanted to present it here because it is part of the biogeochemical cycles, but I'm going to be brief with this because it won't be as crucial in what we're studying. So phosphorus is important too for living organisms, specifically for phospholipids, for cell membranes, for some proteins, and for some nucleic acids. Kind of different with phosphorus is the main abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is rocks and minerals. Phosphorus isn't stored in the atmosphere. It's not a gas. Um, it's not really stored in the water in a huge amount. Rocks and minerals are the main abiotic source or reservoir for phosphorus. Um, and it is broken down usually with water because it's soluble in the soil as soil phosphates, and it goes into terrestrial plants or into aquatic plants by being absorbed through the plant roots. Decomposers, like bacteria and fungi, return phosphorus back to the soil and the water when they break down living organisms, and then it can cycle through again. One thing I wanted to point out, and this is true for the nitrogen cycle as well, but it's this part where it says, loss in drainage. Since nitrogen and phosphorus really enter the biotic food chain through being absorbed through plants' roots from the soil, there is a great possibility that a lot of it can be lost into the water by runoff. And this is where um, the eutrophication of lakes comes from like farm runoff and domestic runoff. So the main abiotic reservoir, rocks and minerals in the soil, enters the food chain by erosion and the fact that phosphates are soluble in water, and then uptaken into plants. Decomposing bacteria and fungi recycle it, turn it back into the soil, and its lost ocean sedimentation is how it really returns back to the abiotic reservoir. And organisms die and it's lost into the sand and the soil down here and turned back into rocks and sediments and minerals. It can return back to the abiotic reservoir. Then lastly, we're going to look at the water cycle. I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this because I know that most of you are probably pretty familiar with the water cycle ever since you learned the song, maybe in your third grade. Um, Large bodies of water, like the ocean and lakes and groundwater, as well as water vapor in the air, like clouds, are the main abiotic reservoirs for water in the water cycle. Precipitation is the main way that the abiotic reservoir of the clouds in the sky moves water down to the ground. And then transpiration, through the evaporation of water through plants back into the atmosphere, returns that water back to the atmospheric reservoir, just as respiration, when we breathe out, there's water vapor in our breath, can return some of that water back to abiotic reservoir in the sky. Or just evaporation from the abiotic reservoirs on land too. So, surface and atmospheric water, lakes, oceans, groundwater, water vapor, abiotic reservoirs. It enters the food chain through precipitation and plants uptaking it through their roots. It's recycled through both transpiration and respiration. And evaporation and runoff really return it to the different abiotic reservoirs. So here's a picture again of transpiration, which just means how water evaporates through plant leaves, through the stomates in plants' leaves out into the atmosphere. And that evaporation helps pull up water from the soil and through the plant stem. Remember when we talked about osmosis diffusion, we said that the atmosphere has the most negative water potential, and as we move down the tree into the soil, it becomes less negative. So because water wants to move from a less negative to a more negative water potential, it is pulled up through the tree through gradually decreasing water potentials and helps aid this process of transpiration. So lastly, we're going to specifically talk about breaking the water cycle, because deforestation breaks the water cycle. Groundwater is not able to be transpired into the atmosphere because trees are gone. So because groundwater can't make it into the atmosphere, the moisture content in the atmosphere can't grow, and so precipitation is lost and we have desertification. Desertification isn't turning things into deserts, it's turning forests into deserts. That's, yeah, never mind. So one way that we can repair the damage is exemplified by like the green belt movement, which consists of planting trees in Kenya to restore that sustainable ecosystem. We add tree biomass, and then we can reconnect the groundwater and the atmosphere through that transpiration process, and we can transform a desert back into a forest and kind of strengthen that part of the water cycle. And that is actually, I think I'm going to stop there. This is kind of a good place to stop. So we will stop here actually and then use the next two slides just as a kind of a review when we start Ecosystem Notes Part 2.